Hey, Mr. Usher here. I'm doing a recording for my full credit class. So if you meet me during your 5th period or your 8th period, this is the wrong video. Anyway, as we kind of have here, I am going to be covering anxious personality disorders, more formally known as Cluster C personality disorders. So in case it wasn't clear from previous lessons, personality disorders as a general category are grouped into 3 groups: Cluster A, Cluster B, and Cluster C. So this is Cluster C, sometimes informally called the anxious personality disorders, and hopefully by the time I finish this video it'll be clear why, right? First, before we got into the lesson proper, there was a DIN. The DIN basically asked you to review stuff from the previous lesson, really from both the Wednesday and the Thursday prior. Basically the dramatic personality disorders, or the Cluster B personality disorders. Some of the really interesting ones, the ones maybe we see a lot in TV and movies, right? Anyway, just 4 multiple choice questions. If you were paying attention, if you were staying on top of things, should be a snap. After that, I did a lecture, essentially, on the 3 disorders that are found in this particular one. I'm going to run through them all relatively briefly, right? So first, there is avoidant personality disorder. So avoidant in this sense means socially avoidant. So people in this category, people who have avoidant personality disorder, are characterized by a frequent avoidance of social situations, right? Especially new social situations. So I believe we have, unless I'm much mistaken. Well, there you go. I believe we have the diagnostic criterion actually on here. Give that a second to load. Alright, yeah, avoidant personality disorder. So, all of the personality disorders describe a pervasive pattern, right? Begins early in adulthood, and you experience it in a variety of contexts, and you have to have a minimum, usually a majority, of a set list of personality features. So for avoidant personality disorder, the person is hypersensitive to negative evaluation, is socially inhibited, and ultimately, this is the big one here, they feel inadequate, right? So the core of this personality disorder is a feeling of inadequacy. They just feel like they are nothing, that they don't matter, that they're worthless, right? Kind of a bad way to feel. Looking at some of the specifics here, they avoid occupational activities that involve significant interpersonal contact, show restraint within intimate relationships because of fear of being shamed. They view themselves as inept, personally unappealing, that kind of a thing. Usually reluctant to take personal risks or engage in new activities, right? So, as an example, somebody with avoidant personality disorder maybe is attracted to somebody else. Do you think they're going to ask them out? Approach them? No. Not without significant treatment, right? Thankfully, as we'll learn with these disorders, unlike with the rest of the personality disorders, there actually is a decent amount of treatment that can work for these disorders. So Cluster C is probably the most optimistic or hopeful of the 3 clusters, because treatment actually does seem to have a significant effect relative to the other disorders, right? In this case, cognitive behavioral therapy can help by trying to reorient people's ideas, right? So if you, for example, are preoccupied with being criticized, right, the therapist can help you to examine why these cognitions are coming up so often, right? If you are usually reluctant to take personal risks, right, you're not behaving in that manner, we can use behavioral conditioning to try to gradually encourage you to engage in more of those. Maybe start small with saying like hi to somebody at a party. Then you jump into maybe like suggesting something, really quietly at a meeting. And then very eventually maybe you build to being able to ask out that person, right? Humanistic therapy can also work. Remember that humanistic therapy is kind of characterized by 3 things. You want to validate the person at every step, right? You want to make them feel like a valid, real person. You want to use active listening. So, if I'm talking about avoidant personality right now, I'm talking about avoidant personality disorder right now and explaining what it is, you actively listening to me would be like, oh, so Mr. Usher, I hear that you're describing avoidant personality disorder to us because it's very important to you that we understand what avoidant personality disorder is. So that's active listening, right? You're showing me that you're listening to me. And then finally, the ultimate goal is unconditional positive regard, which ultimately builds this concept of self-actualization, right? This best version of yourself that you achieve, you being, the maximum of what you can be as who you are, right? And so that can really help somebody who is avoidant, particularly because of this, right? If you ultimately just feel inadequate, humanistic therapy could really help by helping you to just understand really the exact opposite, that you are not inadequate, that you are perfectly adequate just as you are, right? Moving on. Other side of the coin here is dependent personality disorder. So dependent personality disorder, characterized by submissive and clinging behavior, fear of separation. Basically, these people are extremely socially dependent, right? They do not feel like they can be alone. They do not feel like they can get things done on their own. It's hard for them to see themselves as like an individual actor in the world, right? They can get their own stuff done, right? So examples here: needs others to assume responsibility for major areas of life, has difficulty initiating projects or doing things on their own, urgently seeks another relationship as a source of care and support when a close relationship ends, unrealistically preoccupied with fears of being left. So all this stuff is going on in their head of like, people are going to abandon me, people are going to abandon me, people are going to abandon me. Without that being really based in anything logical. One way to think of it almost is that they have a phobia of social abandonment, right? Remember, a phobia is an intense and irrational fear of something, right? It might make sense, say, to be afraid a deadly black widow spider is crawling in your arm, right? But if you're constantly afraid everywhere, even in like a snowy tundra, that you're going to be bit by a spider, that's irrational, right? And similarly, these people have irrational fears of being abandoned, and that is the root of this disorder, just like the feeling of inadequacy is the root for avoidant. Key thing here, right? CBT does work well for this as well, trying to break some of these ideas of like, I can't do things by myself, trying to break that up and trying to encourage new, more independent behaviors. Humanistic therapy, not recommended, right? Because you're likely to over-validate these feelings that the dependent person has of dependency, right? To make them feel like, oh yeah, you should be this dependent. That's totally normal. That's fine. No. Anyway, you want to avoid that, especially because with dependent personality disorder, or DPD, there's a risk that the therapist could become the target for the dependency, right? That the individual with DPD could become dependent on the therapist and latch onto them. So setting boundaries, extremely important. Final one, might sound weirdly familiar. Obsessive-Compulsive personality disorder. Obviously, that sounds very similar to Obsessive-Compulsive disorder, or OCD. And that's because they superficially, or on the surface, right, look the same, right? Like, I might superficially appear to be green, but of course, my skin is not green, right? It's just something that's on the surface. And similarly, both OCPD and OCD superficially look the same, but fundamentally they're different things. And this goes back to the difference between being ego-syntonic and ego-dystonic, right? So let's look up a very brief definition here. So this does ultimately refer to a concept that comes from psychoanalysis, but we don't need to root it ultimately to Freud or some of his wacky ideas. But very basically, as this Wikipedia article accurately describes, ego-syntonic refers to behaviors, values, and feelings that are in harmony with or acceptable to the needs and goals of the ego, the self. So we think we're okay, we're good, right? Ego-dystonic is the opposite, referring to thoughts and behaviors that are in conflict or in dissonant in some way with the needs or goals of the ego, the self. So, the overwhelming majority of mental illnesses are ego-dystonic, right? If you have obsessive-compulsive disorder, if you have major depressive disorder, if you have bipolar depression, if you have depersonalization, derealization disorder, it is not fun. It is unpleasant. It is bad. You do not want to have that. That's why you see a therapist, because you want help. However, with most personality disorders, it is ego-syntonic, right? You think that you're right just the way that you are. In fact, most commonly, you think that everybody else is the problem. Somehow that you are the only right one and everybody else around you is part of the problem. That is the key difference between OCD and OCPD, right? With OCD, it is ego-dystonic. The person does not want to obsess over all these things. They do not want to have a compulsion where maybe they need to wash their hands 17 times every time they go to the bathroom, right? They are pained by that and they feel compelled to do it. But with OCPD, the person engages in similar behaviors and has similar thinking patterns, but they think it's perfectly normal and it's right. And that, in fact, anybody else who isn't exactly as neat and controlling as them is somehow dumb or problematic or stupid or something, right? So basically, this pattern focuses obsessively on orderliness, perfectionism, mental and interpersonal control, is not flexible at all, is not open at all. They're just super efficient all the time. So some key examples here. Preoccupied with details and rules, overly conscientious, right? Remember Ocean, right? O-C-E-A-N. It's the big 5 personality factors. The C in that is conscientiousness, this personality characteristic that is focused on favoring order, discipline, following the rules, neatness, so on and so forth. They are also reluctant to delegate tasks. They need to do everything by themselves. They don't trust other people to get things done right. And they're generally rigid and stubborn, right? So that's OCPD, and keep this in mind, right? Because differential diagnosis is very important. I'm going to be looking for this with your project. One of the excellent examples of why a differential diagnosis is important, right, is that you do not want to misdiagnose somebody who has OCPD with OCD, because the treatment is very different, right? There are some similarities, right? There is some efficacy for both, with both disorders with cognitive behavioral therapy, but medications that might help the anxiety symptoms associated with OCD, not going to work so much with OCPD because this person isn't anxious about what they're doing, right? They think they're fine. Anyway, those are the 3: avoidant, dependent, obsessive-compulsive, the 3 personality disorders in Cluster C. The rest of the class, for the most part, was mostly devoted to a role-playing exercise. I wanted you guys to practice some of the role-playing that I was expecting you guys to do for the project, right? Make sure I get the right document here. So yeah, it's labeled practice skit because it is a practice of the skit that I'm asking you to do for the project. So basically, I ask you to fill this out: clinician, patient, what disorder are you portraying? List the symptoms of that disorder. They should be accurate, right? So I was asking you for this exercise in class, right, to pick one of the 3 I just went over, right? So for the project as a whole, you can pick any number of disorders that we've covered so far, right? But for this particular practice, I want you to pick one of the 3 just to see if you got it. And a differential diagnosis, right? Try to think a little bit about, like, well, how can you tell one disorder from the other, Some classes were good about volunteering here, others not so much, which is disappointing. But to those who volunteered, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Anyway, then there was a ticket out the door. The ticket out the door is basically just compare and contrast all of the personality disorders, all 10 of them together. Which ones do you think, on the one hand, are clinically significant or really worthy of being treated as a mental illness? And which ones, on the other hand, do you think maybe just shouldn't be a mental illness at all? Like why are we treating this like it's, something that is like a sickness when we could just call it a person that is different, right? Anyway, think about that, write a little bit. That's the thing. Questions, of course, please contact me. Otherwise, that is it for the video. Bye.